Good morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up early. Thanks also to the organizers. I've been meaning to come to this workshop for a very long time. Very long, I guess it's only been around for 3 years, but for those whole 3 years I've been wanting to come, and I finally made it. Very happy to be here. Before I forget, this is going to be joint work with Naveen Durvasula. So he's my PhD student at Columbia. He just finished his first year. He'll be here at SBC for the rest of the week. I encourage you to go say hello, and you're going to be hearing a lot more from him in the years to come, I assure you. I am head of research at A16Z, but this is just an academic talk. Needless to say, nothing I say today should be construed as financial advice. I want to talk about restaking. So let's first just talk about staking. Then I want to talk about security. So let's just first sort of review how people often talk about the cryptoeconomic security of a proof of stake blockchain protocol. High level, I mean, we basically want to think about some attacker trying to sort of do a double spend or sort of take over a blockchain protocol. We want to think about a cost-benefit analysis that they might do. What's it going to cost me to launch an attack? What am I going to gain from launching an attack? Okay. So starting point, take your favorite proof of stake protocol, Ethereum, Solana, whatever. That's going to correspond to this vertex right here. It's a distributed protocol. So it's run by a collection of validators who all carry out the protocol. Those are these vertices here on the right. In a proof of stake protocol, validators are usually staked. So that's what these sigmas are. And the point is that the sigmas is what a validator is potentially going to lose should it launch an attack, okay? If someone controls a bunch of validators, if they control enough of the stake, that's going to be necessary and sufficient to carry out an attack, right? So maybe it's 33%, maybe it's 50%, doesn't really matter for our purposes. If enough of the validators, enough of the stake gets together and tries to launch an attack like a double spend, we're going to assume they're going to be able to do that. We're also going to assume that if they actually launch an attack, they will be losing their stake. Okay, so for the cost-benefit analysis of the attacker, we've seen what the costs are. If you launch an attack, you will lose your stake, the stake of the attacking validators. What's the benefit of carrying out an attack? Well, we're just going to summarize that very potentially hard to estimate quantity just with a Greek letter pi. Okay, so we're just going to assert that that's the reward that that's the value you can extract by successfully attacking this proof of stake protocol. Okay. And so then, an attacker's sort of cost-benefit analysis, they just compare the stake they might lose, so the sum of the sigmas of the attacking validators against the reward pi that they would get from that attack. And informally, we think of a proof-of-stake protocol as being cryptoeconomically secure if the cost exceeds the benefit. Okay, so if the sum of the sigmas, that's the lost stake, is bigger than the reward of carrying out the attack. Okay, obviously, the bigger the gap between these two quantities, the better. Okay, the bigger the buffer, in some sense, more cryptoeconomically secure is the protocol. Quick aside, quick digression. People like to, have noisy debates about cryptoeconomic security, like is it a meme, is it meaningful, et cetera. My viewpoint is, when I listen to people debating it, I think almost everyone agrees it's a useful thought experiment to put yourselves in the shoes of an attacker and to do this cost-benefit analysis and try to figure out whether it's potentially worth it for the attacker or not. I think almost everyone agrees that's sort of a good exercise to do. I actually think most of the disagreement is just on what should these numbers be? Like what should the sigmas be? What should the pi be? Right? So for sigmas, I've sort of told the story as if that's just stake kind of locked up in a contract that maybe gets programmatically slashed. One argument would be, but maybe a lot of these validators are sort of known quantities and actually their reputational cost would be far greater than the stake they would lose from an attack. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. Pi, very tricky, right? How should you measure, should you use the market cap of a blockchain protocol as a proxy for the reward, or should you also consider, ecosystems that are built on top of the protocol? All tricky questions, none of which I'm going to answer in today's talk. For today, the sigmas and the pi are all given. Okay. All right, so where does restaking come in? Well, suppose some of the validators running one of these proof-of-stake protocols are bored. Okay, so what if they have the computational resources to do far more than just run this blockchain protocol? How should those cycles be used? Okay, so a really cool idea, which has sort of gotten a lot of discussion in this couple of sort of very high-profile projects launching over the past couple of years, would be let's build, in effect, a matching market which matches spare cycles, okay, that these validators have to services that would be willing to pay for those cycles, okay, for whatever reason, okay? And there's a lot of gains for trade that could potentially arise from these kinds of restaking networks, right? So obviously, the validators, if they have excess kind of just resources, they might be happy to get rewards beyond just the basic blockchain protocol rewards. They might be happy to be paid in tokens or otherwise from some additional service that they're helping run. On the other hand, if you're spinning up a new service, right, and you don't really want to like build your own sort of L1, you don't really want to kind of recruit a decentralized validator set, you're very happy to just kind of inherit the decentralization of an existing mature validator set. Okay, so lots of gains from trade potentially from these matching markets, and that's what I mean by a restaking network. But then you do think, okay, well, if a validator is not merely securing some blockchain protocol, but also doing a bunch of other stuff at the same time, you know, in some sense, that stake of the validator is being reused to secure many, possibly many things, right? And that might make you like a little bit nervous, right? So maybe somehow this validator is being stretched thin. Maybe this sort of economic security is being split between the things it's securing in some way that leads to some kind of risk, right? And that's what I want to think about. So when is it safe to reuse validators, not just for the original blockchain protocol, but for potentially many other services as well, okay? So formally, I want to think about a restaking network just as a bipartite graph, okay? Same validators that we had before, sigmas being their stakes. You can think of this second service as being like the old blockchain protocol that all of the validators are running. But you'll notice now we have 3 additional services where a subset of the validators have opted in to help secure them, right? 3 out of the 5 validators for each of these 3 services. Each of the service now has its own kind of reward for attacking it. Okay, those are these pies. And unlike the previous slide, where there was only kind of the one service, the one blockchain protocol, and in some sense you were either secure or not, right? Either the sigmas was bigger than the pi or it wasn't. Now that we're working with restaking networks, security is an inherently combinatorial notion, meaning it involves lots of subsets, right? To call a restaking network secure, we really would ideally like to say that there's no subset of validators capable of profitably attacking any subset of services, right? That's what we'd like to be able to say. Okay? That's what we would think of as a restaking network being secure, okay? So let's think about that a little bit more. Okay, ideally, no subset of validators should be in a position to carry out a profitable attack on any subset of services. So this is the same network. It's just I've turned all the sigmas and all of the pies into ones. Okay, and you can look at this network and you can ask, is this a secure network? And you're like, well, you know, at least the total stake 5 is bigger than the total reward you could get 4. Okay, so it's a good sign. It's a sort of necessary condition for security. But again, we want it to be that no subset of validators can attack any subset of services profitably, okay? And so now let's actually, just for the example, let's suppose that validators can attack a service if they control at least half of the stake, okay? So 50% of the stake that's supporting a service is necessary and sufficient to attack it, and the corresponding reward. And then you notice actually there is a valid attack on this network, which is if the middle 3 validators get together, they're under this assumption on the right, these 3 validators are in a position to successfully attack all 4 of the services, right? They have 2/3 of the stake for the top and the bottom service, 3/5 of the stake for the second service, and 100% of the stake for the third service. So they're above the 50% threshold for all 4. So they're capable of carrying this out, and moreover, it's profitable. It will cost them 3 units of stake. It will earn them 4 units of reward. Okay? So we would say that this network is not secure, that there is a valid attack. If you insist on sort of more collateral, if you scale up the stakes of all of the validators, if you double them, then you can check that this is in fact a secure network. Okay? If you pick any subset of validators and any subset of services they're in a position to attack, the stake they will lose will exceed the profit that they will earn, okay? 2 is actually overkill here. So actually, if all of those 2s were 4/3, you can check, it would be secure, just barely. So in some sense, this network is over-collateralized by 50%. 4/3 would be sufficient, it's actually 2 on the right-hand side. That 50% will be a very, very important parameter in today's talk. Okay. Now, we would like not just security, okay, not just there's no valid attack, but we'd also like some buffer. Remember on the very first slide, we said we'd like it if the sum of the sigmas was well larger than pi, okay? For various reasons. I mean, one, you know, you might be worried that you're sort of mismeasuring the pies or something like that, so you'd like some robustness to that. Or especially once you're talking about a restaking network with possibly lots of validators and lots of services, just feels like random stuff might happen, right? Maybe there's some sort of, I don't know, malicious service that sort of winds up triggering slashing conditions for a small set of validators that are supporting it. Who knows, okay? The point is we'd like to sort of poke our restaking networks and ask that they're not just secure, but they stay secure even after we kind of give them a hard poke in the form of a small shock, okay? So the sudden loss of some of the stake, okay, for whatever reason, okay? So to see what I mean, so the concern, I should say, intuitively, the worry is that you have a network which is secure by the old definition, but once there's a small shock, it suddenly enables a valid attack. And maybe even worse, maybe there's a cascade. Maybe after that first valid attack, more validators lose their stake, more attacks become feasible, and so on. And who knows what happens at the end of the day, okay? So just to give a toy example, let's take our last example, but replace the 2's with 2 minus epsilon. Okay, so now rather than being 50% over collateralized on the right, this is 49% over collateralized on the right. Okay, definitely this is a secure network. That's not the concern. The concern is what happens when there's a shock. Okay, so let's look at actually what's a pretty big shock. Let's suppose this middle validator just for whatever reason goes away. I guess that's a 20% shock, okay, which is big, but now we want to ask, is this network still secure? Is it still the case that no subset of the remaining validators can profitably attack any subset of the services, remembering that the attack threshold for attacking a service is 50% of the stake that's supporting it. Some of the supporting stake has gone away. That may change whether or not this condition is met, okay? And indeed, if you look at the middle 2 validators on the right, okay, they are now, after the shock, in a position to by themselves attack all 4 of the services, right? They have 50% of the stake on the top and the bottom, 50% of the stake on the second service, and 100% of the stake on the third service. So they meet the 50% threshold for all 4. They will lose 4 minus 2 epsilon stake for doing it, but they'll get 4 for it. So that's a just barely profitable attack, okay? And again, in a bigger network, you can imagine that once this first valid attack happens and then the attackers lose their stake, that could then still trigger further valid attacks after that, an entire cascade, okay? So this is what the results of this paper are meant to understand, okay? So under what conditions can you say it's not a big deal if there's a small shock, okay? In this example, we start with, again, a pretty big shock, 20%, but ultimately we lost much more than 20% of the stake. We lost 60% of the stake because these 2 validators lose their stake also after their attack, okay? And so the answer to this, or at least the first result, the answer turns out to be very clean, okay? Trying to understand what could be the consequences of a small shock and what is it that controls that blow up that we just saw. And it turns out it's basically completely controlled by the overcollateralization factor, okay? By which I mean just what I was calling 50% or 49% before. Formally, okay, how do you define this? So it's going to be a parameter gamma. Gamma is going to correspond to like that 50%. So you start by just writing down the inequalities that define the basic notion of security, that just any sort of attack should be unprofitable. So if you look at some validators that have enough stake to successfully attack all the services in A, then the cost they incur from attacking, the stake they would lose, should be at least the total reward, the total benefit they would get. And then you insist that this holds also with a buffer, okay? And gamma is just the largest, the overcollateralization factor is the largest value of gamma for which this scaled up and for which this buffer condition holds, okay? So it's not just that you're secure kind of in an overkill way, okay? So even if the rewards were 1 plus gamma factor larger than they actually are, you would still be secure, okay? So that's the key condition, gamma overcollateralized. And in fact, in any sort of restaking network, okay, for any value of the initial shock psi, which you should think of as small, you will indeed lose not just that shock, okay, but also potentially subsequent valid attacks that are enabled by it. So you will have a blow up as we've seen, but the blow up will be at worst 1 plus 1 over gamma, okay? So the bigger gamma is, the bigger this buffer, the more you're over collateralized, the less of a blow up you'll have in the amount of stake that you ultimately lose, okay? So you started by losing a psi fraction of the stake, you wind up losing a psi blown up by a 1 plus 1 over gamma factor fraction of the stake, okay? This is tight in the sense that you give me a value of psi and a gamma, I will give you back a restaking network and a shock of size psi so that you actually will lose this much of the stake after the consequent attacks. You, in fact, have already seen that this is tight in the special case of psi equals 0.2 and gamma equals arbitrarily close to 0.5. That's what the example with the 2 minus epsilons already showed us. Question?
Yeah, so this gamma depends on the set A and B, or is it a maximization over all sets? So
Yeah, it should hold for every set. So yeah, I guess this is a little loosely stated. So such that for every A comma B, such that B can attack A. That's the formal sort of version of that. So gamma is uniform over A and B. Yeah. And I guess if you remember only one slide from this talk, this is just the first result in the paper, and there's more that we're very proud of. But if you're just going to remember like one thing from this talk or paper, this is probably the right slide to remember. Okay. Overcollateralization is both necessary and sufficient for robust security in the sense that a small shock cannot have catastrophic consequences. Okay. All right. But we have a generalization of this that we quite like and that we think pushes this closer to being of practical relevance. Suppose, right, so we're thinking in the future, right, when you have thousands of validators, thousands of services, it's just like, this huge ecosystem. And now suppose, you run a service or a collection of services, right? So maybe there's an ecosystem and there's 6 like super important services that power that ecosystem. And the 6 services know each other well. Maybe they have like contracts with validators that they trust, and they don't really know what's going on with these thousands of other validators and services, okay? In that event, like these 6 services in capital C are not going to be so reassured by the guarantee I just gave you for several reasons, okay? So first of all, they're going to say like, how do I even know that overcollateralization condition holds in this restaking network, right? I don't know what's up with these like random services I've like never heard of that are part of the restaking network. How would I check that condition? How do I know they're pies, for example? Or, even otherwise, this is all predicated on the shock being small, right? I don't know, like 10%, 1%, whatever. And it's kind of like, okay, maybe I'm quite confident in like our validators, right? Because like we trust them, we know who they are, we know they're sort of like conscientious. Oh, maybe all these other validators are terrible and they're just going to lose their stake because they're just badly operated. Okay, so how do I know that the shock outside of my local neighborhood is going to be small? And then finally, the third thing would be like, okay, it's great to say that like a 0.1% shock would sort of only lead to a 1.1% loss of the overall stake. But what if I'm in that 1%? Right? What if the shock has to do with people I've never met, and then I'm actually the collateral damage in the 1.1%, right? So it's much more meaningful to have guarantees that are specific to some target subset of services, okay? Just based on kind of their local trust assumptions, in effect, okay? So the goal is to have an analog, really a generalization of the guarantee I already showed you, which instead of saying like, if the network is over-collateralized, then small shocks can only result in small loss of stake, we want to say if we have a network and a subset of services so that the services are locally over-collateralized, some condition they're in a position to check, then every shock sort of in their neighborhood, which is small, can only lead to an overall loss of a small amount of stake in their neighborhood. Okay, that's what we want to sort of drive toward. Yeah.
So number 3 points to concern that is not just from the point of view of someone who belongs to C, but from someone who wants to trust C, but they kind of see them as potentially defecting in case of some shock.
Good. I mean, if I understand, I mean, certainly the users of the services in C are also share these concerns, right? So that'd be one thing to say. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that, if I'm in C, I will say any kind of shock will not lead me, and I'm honest, I will not then try to trick the system and steal money and go away. So I'm not afraid of myself turning rational and exploiting the shock to gain some benefit. I'm afraid of others doing that, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. That's fair. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, do you mind clarifying what you mean by loss of stake? I'm not sure I really understand.
Sure. So there's an initial shock, which means I take some of the stake that was in the network, and either you can think of it as I just like throw out some validators, or maybe a validator sort of loses half their stake for whatever reason. So that's the initial loss of stake.
It just disappears.
It disappears. Yeah. Think of it as like if you want, think of that someone double voted and there was slashing, for example, right? But again, the model is agnostic to why, and in particular for the shock, I want to allow possibilities that it's just like software bugs causing the slashing for whatever reason. Yeah. Yeah.
One question. So with what you just said, in this scenario where the subsets are kind of the
loss to constraint? From a utilitarian standpoint, yes, nothing bad would happen, but how do you propagate that information to the other subset? Have you guys explored like a zero knowledge proof way of doing that? Like one subset knows that the neighboring subset will not ruin their stake, but you don't really need to disclose the exact amount of stake or anything.
So I guess the question is, how would you check that a condition like this holds? Is that sort of the?
Yeah, like in the you just mentioned in the future when there's a larger pool.
Right.
The validators we're talking about. I'm saying with this, the larger pool, how do you communicate that this was holding?
Yeah, so the whole goal here is that you don't have to do that. The goal here is to have a condition where you don't have to communicate outside of your friends, basically. That's exactly what we're driving toward. Yeah. Okay, so I will be able to give you a statement of this form, right? So again, we want to say that, like, you know, as long as kind of in the neighborhood of these services, things are over collateralized, then any shock, which only it sort of starts by removing a small amount of stake in the neighborhood, even after an arbitrary cascade of valid attacks, it will still be the case that there's only a small loss of stake in this local neighborhood. To make this precise, I have three things I need to define for you, and there's actually going to be some other technical complications that come up as well, which I'll mention just very briefly, okay? So we need to define all of the three things in quotes. Two of the three are actually quite easy. So what we're going to do is we're going to define, so again, we have these 6 services. Capital gamma of C, I'm using that to denote the validators that exclusively provide security to services in capital C. Okay, they do not provide security to any services except for those in capital C. And in some sense, from the services in capital C's perspective, like, these are the validators you're really counting on. Right? Like, these are the ones that you're trusting to kind of like really serve your services. The ones that are sort of both kind of providing security to you and to sort of potentially other services you've never heard about, you know, those validators, not clear what's going to happen. If they're sort of also providing security to some other services that turn out to be buggy or malicious, maybe those validators are going to get slashed and you're sort of less sure about that. Okay? So that's the idea. So we start with a set of services. It induces a corresponding set of validators, the validators that provide security only to services of capital C. Okay, so that's going to answer 2 of what I mean by local. So when we talk about a small shock, what we're going to mean is that initially only a small fraction of the stake owned by validators in gamma of C is lost. Okay, so small shock meaning just to the validators in gamma of C. What are we going to mean by at the end of the day, after all of the attacks have played out and the dust have settled? What are we going to mean that there was not much stake loss? We're going to mean not much stake owned by validators in gamma of C has been lost. So we're looking at the blow up just in the stake loss within these validators in gamma of C, the validators that are exclusive to the set capital C. I still owe you a definition of locally over collateralized. Actually, before I do that, let me tell you about the 2 technical complications, okay? And apologies, I'll have to say these like very quickly. They're actually very, very simple. Okay, if I had 5 more minutes, I would just give you the examples that show you why this happens, okay? And there's very simple examples in the paper if you want to learn more, okay? So the first compromise we're going to make in our global guarantee, you'll notice that the guarantee on the eventual stake loss was after an arbitrary cascade of valid attacks. Okay, so the initial stake is lost. That might enable a valid attack. That valid attack might enable another one, and so on. But again, when the dust settles, this was the bound we had on the stake loss. It turns out you have to change this word to get a guarantee in the local case. Okay, so it turns out, and we prove this, we prove it's impossible to have any kind of guarantee on local security if you allow arbitrary valid attacks. And we need to restrict to a subset that we call stable attacks. The good news is it's a well-motivated definition. If I had the extra few minutes and explained it to you, I think actually all of you would find this very reasonable. I don't think it would bother you. It basically just says you focus on attacks that are in some sense minimal, that don't have sort of spurious validators riding on, right, sort of free riding on top of them. Okay? So that's the first change in the theorem statement we provably need to make. The second thing is we need to over-collateralize more pairs than you might expect. Okay, so you might recall in the global guarantee, we just said any subset of any set B of validators capable of attacking any set A of services. Here we're going to have to over-collateralize not only pairs of that form, but also something we call attack headers. And again, I'll have to defer you to the paper for the formal definition. But in effect, things have to be over-collateralized in the neighborhood of C, even if validators outside of this trusted set, even if validators outside of gamma of C, in some sense are allowed to join the attack for free. Okay, and again, I know that's pretty vague, but it is, again, if I had a few more minutes, it would be easy to explain. So don't be scared of it if you want to check out the paper. Okay. And then the good news is those two compromises are not merely necessary to extend to local guarantees, they're also sufficient. Okay, so here's the analog of what we saw of our first result, but now specialized for a set C of services. You'll notice we have the exact same 1 + 1 over gamma blow up. Okay, so in some sense, the conclusion is the same, but I've already sort of foreshadowed what all of the changes need to be. So here we actually say that rather than whenever we have A and B where B can attack A, we need this more general notion of a attack header. So that's a superset of the pairs AB we had before, but otherwise it's the same overcollateralization condition. And then you also see where we're allowing actually cascades only of stable attacks. Again, that's the subset, well-motivated subset of the attacks we had before. And then when I talk about the initial shock of a psi fraction, that's projected within the validators of gamma of C, the ones that are exclusive to C. And similarly, when we talk about this eventual stake loss, that is also relative to the overall stake in gamma of C. Yeah.
So in like a practical restaking network, you're going to have sort of a main network, usually like Ethereum, where all of the validators are staking into. So how does that come into play here with this like local neighborhood? Because you wouldn't have like a local neighborhood with only like a subset of validators if every validator is providing service to this like main network like Ethereum.
Yeah, so it's a good point. So the simplest way to think about it, I mean, you could extend the model, but the simplest way to think about it is just, suppose we just assume that Ethereum is going to be fine, and then just apply this result. So in other words, take that node out of the network, right? And be like, that's the least of our problems, right? Let's think about these sort of thousands of services that are sort of much less battle tested. And then this applies directly. Alternatively, you could have a more complex model where you sort of allow the superposition of these two. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yep.
Why do we, it seems that this only affects, this whole model is just about these exclusive validators. Do the non-exclusive validators even help us then, really? Or should we just say we should only use validators that exclusively stake to us?
So basically, yeah. So basically, the validators that are not exclusively staked to you can make your life harder. The way that, I mean, it's basically wrapped up in this definition of an attack header. This is where so if you, I mean, this basically says, right, so you're not okay if it's just that any subset of validators in gamma of C aren't motivated to sort of attack services in C. Because the problem might be maybe validators outside of that set sort of go down and sort of enable this attack, right? So yeah, in some sense, it kind of says, well, I mean, it's a worst case analysis is one thing to notice, right? But it basically says, like, if you're going to assume worst case among validators that you don't know anything about, don't use them, basically. So, and they can actually materially make your life worse, basically, by using them. Yeah. Okay.
Pretty much done.
I got a shrug. I asked for the remaining time. I got a shrug. Is that 1 minute? Is that -1 minute? Is that? Okay. All right. All right. So we talked about how you can have these cascades of attacks following a shock. All of the bounds I've given you are after an arbitrary length cascade sequence. You can also study cascades in their own right, and there's some interesting stuff there. Basically, what's cool is this overcollateralization factor gamma not only bounds the total amount of stake you're going to lose, but also how long one of those cascades can be. Basically, it drops from linear to logarithmic if you have overcollateralization. Okay, so this is the last slide. This is just sort of a restatement of all the results we saw. I'll just let you read those here. I mean, one thing I will say is, and hopefully this sort of came through in the talk, I mean, we're shooting for kind of a minimal model, right? That on the one hand, did not really focus on details of any particular implementation. On the other hand, we tried to capture the essence of sort of some of the risks of validator reuse. And another goal of having the model be so simple is so that other researchers it would be easy to build upon. And there's already some follow-up work I recommend you check out by Tarun Chitra and Nilesh Pai. I'm very much hoping to see other follow-up work, hopefully by some of the people in this room. So thanks very much.